Hey guys, Seth Perkins, Bearded Butcher Blend Seasoning, White Feather Meats. As you can see, we're inside the holding cooler here at White Feather Meats, and today we're going to show you how we cut up a half a bison. We're going to start with the front quarter, which is going to be part one, and then we're going to move on to the hind quarter, which is going to be part two. So these animals were harvested right here on site. They've dry aged at 32, 33 degrees right in there, and now they're ready to be cut up. So come along, let me show you how to do it. All right guys, so the very first thing we're going to do here is we're going to break this shank portion off of this, this bison. Now this can be used cross-cut shank, soup bones, ossobuco, things like that. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and break this shank off of here. Starting by cutting through this knuckle. Everything on these carcasses is held together by a seam and a knuckle. So if you learn the different knuckles, you can break this animal down. Now I should mention, typically I would be using a bandsaw for this. But today, we're not going to be using a bandsaw. We're going to do everything by hand and with the help of a handsaw occasionally. So bear in mind that typically we would be using the handsaw. Now that I have my shank removed, I'm going to go ahead and remove this bone out of the shoulder clod. Now if you had a bandsaw, you could use this, you could cut arm roasts, pot roasts, and you could leave the bone in. But today, since we're not using the bandsaw, I'm going to go ahead and remove this bone, and we're just going to make some boneless roast type items. There's a knuckle in here. It'll be a little bit difficult to find and cut out, but once you get this little joint popped, you can cut this knuckle and this bone will pull out. So now we have that bone removed, and we'll save everything. We'll get everything cleaned up here in a little bit. So as you can see, I've now removed my shank and my bone that was in there. So this is my shoulder clod. We have a brisket, we have the arm, we have the chuck, we have the blade steaks, the flat iron, mock tender, we have the neck. So we're just going to continue to break this thing down. I'm going to go ahead and flip it over. At this point, I'm going to remove my brisket. There's these soft bones right here that you can cut through with a knife. So I'm not going to use a saw for those. Removing my brisket. And we'll get all these trimmed out here after we get the animal broke down. Now at this point, this is where I'm going to grab my handsaw. I'm going to make a cut across these ribs right here. Now that I have that cut through those rib bones, I can then take my 8-inch knife, cutting down through that meat. And what I have here is that arm portion of that chuck with the ribs on the top. These can be cut into brontosaurus ribs, short ribs. We can do off of this portion. We can do some roasts. I'll go ahead and break this down a little bit further. And you can see there's a seam right here. We'll go ahead and seam this out. into this beautiful chunk of bison. You can cut that into some roasts. We can cut it up into some steaks, whatever you wish. Stew meat, canning meat, that sort of thing. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the neck off of this chuck. This is a portion that can be a little bit more difficult. You do need to find these knuckles right here in this neck bone. And not using a saw can take a little bit of practice finding these. Be a little bit of a challenge getting them broke off of here. Using the tip of your knife to work your way through that bone. Once you get that knuckle broke, you can then cut that neck right off. So as you can see, what I'm left with now is just that square, nice square chuck portion. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the top blade steaks off of this, otherwise known as the flat iron, and I'll show you how to separate and seam those out. I like to use a meat hook for this. So right on the top of this chuck is where the shoulder blade is located. So if you find that shoulder blade bone, you can run your knife right along that blade and you can, this is where you need to be careful that you don't slip and stick your knife. As you can see, I am wearing chainmail just to have that extra precaution that you don't stab yourself. That's the top blade steak, otherwise known as the flat iron. We'll get that all seamed out nice and get that all cleaned up. Next piece will be the mock tender. Typically, we're not saving this as a cut. Usually we just use it for stew meat or stir fry, or occasionally somebody will order a mock tender and we'll cut it up. But typically that's going to be some stew meat or stir fry, that sort of thing. Now is when we remove the blade bone. Using my hook, get my knife underneath the blade, working my way down. The key with when you're doing stuff like this is you want to try to keep as much meat on the animal as you can, and then that way, when you come back to clean your bones, there's not a whole lot of work that needs done to them. Plus you have all that extra added value left on the chunk of meat that you're gonna save. So now that we have the blade bone removed, we're gonna go ahead and remove our chuck eye. This is where your chuck roasts come from, your chuck eye roasts. We're just gonna go ahead and pull that right out of there. As you can see, making the right cuts. That just pretty much falls out. Beautiful chunk of bison. Gonna make some chuck roasts. Maybe these are gonna be boneless, of course. Maybe we'll roll them and tie them. Make them look real pretty. There's this yellow piece of cordage that needs to be removed. Once you get that started, you can pull that out. Just gonna square it up a little bit. And anything that I'm trimming off of this as I'm cutting is just simply going into our trimmings bucket, and we'll make some ground bison out of it, some patties and some of those items. All right. Now this piece here, you can see these long bones on here. That's where the hump was. We have some ribs here. You can cut these off. You can make some short ribs. Today we're just going to trim those out for ground bison. Brisket, we have the shoulder roast, the arm roast, flat iron, chuck roast, ribs, mock tender. We have a neck, trimmings, just a nice soup bone. You can make some bison bone broth. And then we have the shank, of course, which can be cut up into some cross-cut shank, some ossobuco. So now now that we have it all broke down into pieces, we're gonna go ahead and just continue making this into smaller, more merchandisable, usable cuts. The neck, typically with the neck, we just bone this out into ground bison. You can cut it up into pieces. You can use this for, you know, some roasts, some stewing meat, things of that nature. So let's go ahead and get started with the brisket. And I'll show you how we trim that out. Following the back of this bone. Now, if I would have cut this on the bandsaw, this brisket may have been a little bit wider, a little bit larger, just because I wanted to follow those bones. So that's, you know, kind of where it led me. Still a beautiful bison brisket nonetheless. Always try to square things up, make them look real nice. I think maybe we'll cut this into some brontosaurus ribs. Typically, we cut them about 4 ribs long. The rest we'll just trim out for ground bison. Just want to square these up a little bit. Now what I always like to do is I like to take my hook and peel this membrane off the top of these ribs. So just go ahead and remove that membrane, peels off there real nice. Maybe trim just a little bit of this back off of here, just to continue to square them up a little bit. And then what you have is a brontosaurus rib, bison short rib, a very nice chunk of meat. It has the bone in it. You throw this on your big green egg, your smoker in your backyard. Let it go low and slow. Maybe throw some original Bearded Butcher Blend seasoning on there. Guaranteed to be incredible. Next piece we're going to do is a flat iron. So this is that top blade steak. Has the membrane on the top here. You just want to separate that membrane. Working your way down. You want to take this outer layer off. Trying to stay as close to the membrane as you can, so you don't waste that meat. You can see we got all that membrane removed. Now what we want to do is sort of use the fish fillet method. There's a piece of connective tissue or gristle right in the middle of this flat iron, so you want to remove that. As you can see, I'm just taking my knife and following right along the top of that gristle. Flip it over and do the same thing on this side. Staying as close to that gristle as you can. So there we have two amazing pieces of meat with that connective tissue removed. As you can see, we stayed real close. You can almost see through it. That's what you want. Just want to square this up a little bit. Typically, we cut these into thirds. The amazing thing about a flat iron steak is when you cook these, they actually swell up. So second most tender cut on the animal next to the tenderloin or the fillet. So a flat iron steak is definitely worth mentioning. When you go to your local butcher, highly recommended. Grab yourself a flat iron. Come in here, grab yourself a flat iron. We'd love to sell you one. Very, very good, high quality steak that we highly recommend. Okay, I think we'll move on to the chuck roll. I'm gonna go ahead and cut some boneless rolled and tied chuck roast. Get my butcher's twine out here. We're gonna go ahead and roll some of these up and make them look nice and fancy. Keeps the meat held together. It's a nice presentation. We like to do it this way. Typically what I'll do is I'll throw my strings on first, and then I'll go down through and I'll cut them. As you can see how I'm tying the string, I go around the meat and I make one tie, and then I'll tie it the second time, but not making your knot tight. So leave your knot loose, and then you can go ahead and push your string down, making it nice and tight. And then you can go ahead and put your final knot on there. And that'll hold everything together and cinch it down real nice. Just continuing my way down through here. I try to separate my strings so that where I'm going to be making my cut, I space it a little bit wider there. This whole roll probably weighs, I'm going to say somewhere in the 10 to 12 pound range. We'll cut some nice 3 to 4 pound roasts out of it. Or if you wanted to, I mean, you could just leave this thing whole and do the whole thing if you had a big enough party to feed. But the way we merchandise it here in our store, folks like the nice, manageable size roasts. They can feed 4 to 6 people and then have some leftovers typically. So, but we can cut them any size you'd like. So after I get my roll done, I like to square it up. On both ends. This will be used for some ground bison. And then we'll just go down through here and we'll start cutting it into roasts. So as you can see, some very nice boneless bison chuck roasts. So this is the arm portion, and you can cut this up into some cutlets or some stew meat, or an arm roast. You know what? let's cut it into some stew. I think that's a great idea. We already went ahead and cut the chuck roast, so we're going to cut some bison stew meat, removing all this outside membrane. That way you're left with some real nice lean cubes for bison stew. We usually try to cut them about an inch square. It's a nice manageable size piece. We'll get this connective tissue out of the center here. See a real nice lean piece of meat for some stew meat. So when we cut stew, we just cut this into strips. If one gets a little wide on you, you can always just cut it in half. And then we just start cutting into cubes. Some real nice, beautiful bison stew meat. So my parents started raising bison in 1987 here in Ohio. So we've grown up around these animals. We've eaten them our whole life. And the key with bison is it's such a leaner protein that you have to be careful when you cook it that you don't overcook it. So that's the biggest thing to keep in mind. It's sort of like cooking venison, however, it's not gamey at all, unless you get maybe a real old bison bull or something like that. But for the most part, bison is just a fantastic protein. And to think that at one point they were near extinction, now they've been brought back and they're thriving here in the United States. So we're huge fans, and we obviously love to eat them. So got us a real nice pile of bison stew. Maybe we'll trim this mock tender out of here, this petite tender. Like I said, typically this just goes into stew meat or stir fry or that sort of thing, but today maybe we'll trim it down into a little roast. You can make little cutlets out of it if you want. Little mock tender steaks. The reason why it's called a mock tender is because it actually looks like a tenderloin when you get it all trimmed out. There's your nice mock tender. Now I mentioned the bones earlier. We do save all the bones for soup, for stock, for bone broth. And as you can see with this trimming pile, I'm going to go back through this pile and do some further trimming. We'll remove any excess fat out of there. There's a gland in here. We'll get rid of that. Any type of connective tissue, gristle, we'll go ahead and get all that removed before we grind that into ground bison. So just keep that in mind. We're not done with that yet. Now we're going to go ahead and just cut this front shank. Now typically I would use my bandsaw and I would cut this into maybe 3 cross-cut shank pieces. But today, since we're doing it by hand, we're going to use the handsaw. And I can show you that, that can be achieved without the use of a bandsaw. For those of you that want to do, let's say you want to do an elk carcass, you want to do a beef carcass in your garage, your barn, that sort of thing. This video is to show you that is achievable with just the use of a handsaw. You don't need, obviously a big fancy bandsaw definitely saves time, but you certainly don't let it prohibit you from doing this task. It can be done with a handsaw on a very limited budget. So we'll go ahead and just make these cross-cut shank pieces, cutting through the meat first so that it's easier to cut. It's harder to cut through the meat than it is the bone with a handsaw. So. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove the meat off the neck. If you wanted to use this for a roast or something like that, you certainly can. Like I mentioned, we're just going to use it for ground bison, so. See all that nice meat that we will go through, and we'll get all the fat and gristle and everything out of it here shortly. So for sake of time on this video, we're not going to take the time to go through our trim pile for the video. So just bear that in mind as we go. We're trying to show you the basic cuts and how to remove and extract them and cut them into pieces, mainly without the use of a bandsaw. So that's the goal here with this video, and just to educate you on the American bison. Okay, that's the chuck portion. Now it's time to cut up the ribs. All right, now it's time for the rib portion. So what you have here is rib section, short ribs, plate, and skirt. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to remove all of those. We'll start with removing the skirt. There's the skirt steak. We will remove the membrane off of that, and I'll show you how to do that here in a minute. First step we're going to do with this rib portion is we're going to remove this plate. Here again, there's these soft bones that you can kind of get through there with your knife with this cartilage. As you can see, I use my bigger breaking knife. I start my way down through there, and you can zip through those bones. So this would be your plate. There is another piece of skirt on the inside of here. It's not quite as desirable as this one, so if you wanted to save it, you can. We typically just save the real nice inside one there for what we're using them for. So got my skirt, I have my skirt removed. my skirt steak removed. I have my plate removed. And now I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start working on this rib. So typically what you want to do is you look at this eye right here. You can see the shoulder blade bone. And you want to start just a couple inches in front of that blade bone. And you want to work your way all the way across these bones. And you want to land just on this side of that rib eye because you don't want to go cutting into that. So starting up at the front here, we're going to take our saw and we're going to work our way down through these ribs. Completely sawing through those, we've removed our ribs. So these, obviously, short ribs. I saved the brontosaurus ribs off the front or off the chuck portion. These, you can cut these into a 2-inch thick slice, make short ribs. You can cut them in bigger chunks, make your brontosaurus style ribs. Today, we are simply going to trim these out. And we're going to use them for ground bison. So since I did save these ribs over here, these are going to be ground meat today. Now the next thing I'm going to do is remove this chine bone off of this rib section. And any of you butchers out there know that this can be a little bit of a task, a challenging task, removing this with a handsaw. So just bear that in mind. Typically what I would do is I would put this up on my bandsaw and I would hold it like this and just cut right through there. So it's definitely more of a challenge with the handsaw. So I got those bones removed off the top. Like I said, that's the part that can be a bit of a challenge with the handsaw, but we got it done. So now I'm going to show you how to process this down into steaks. You can make it into a roast, whichever you prefer. Today we're going to cut it into some steaks. Here again, I like to remove the membrane off these ribs. Makes it a lot better, more pleasurable when you eat it. Not have to deal with the membrane on there. Removing these small bones. Anything like this that we take off, we're going to go down through here and get these all cleaned up because we don't want anything to go to waste. So we'll take as much time as we need to get these bones as clean as we possibly can. Any bones that are left over, like I mentioned earlier, make excellent stock, bone broth, feed them to your pets. Whatever you wish. Removing this ribeye cap here. Following this seam. As I'm following the seam, you can see I'm using my knife to kind of help it along. We'll remove this yellow cord. Helping it with my knife as we go. Now is when we'll take our back ribs off. Staying as close to the bone as we can leaving that meat on the ribeye section here once we're done. Bison back ribs, excellent to barbecue. Smoke them low and slow. Here's your rib steaks, your ribeye roast, your standing rib, whatever you want to make that into today. We're going to go ahead and cut it into some steaks. We'll start with squaring this up. We're going to cut these about 1.25 inches or so. Just a real nice bison ribeye steak. Now this was a bison bull, about 28 months of age. So you can see not a lot of fat on him, but there was some. But it's just super tender. I mean, when I'm cutting this thing, so tender. I don't even have to question whether it's going to be a delicious animal. If anybody else's mouth's watering while I'm cutting these, but mine sure is. Ribeye steaks are definitely my favorite, whether it be bison or beef or whatever the species. You just can't beat a ribeye steak. And there you have it. Now, if I was going to cut a roast, obviously I just would have left a portion of them as a whole piece, and I wouldn't I would have not cut them into steaks. But today, those are going to get merchandised as bison ribeyes. So I wanted to show you how we do that. Moving on to the skirt steak. I'll show you how to pull this membrane off of here. This is the diaphragm muscle. But you can see the muscle fibers are going this direction, so this is a great piece to grill. You can marinate it, cut it into stir fry. You can roll it up, fill it with some of your favorite ingredients. You can tie it, just grill it that way, and then slice it up. But tons of flavor. It has this marbling in between these fibers. So you can see just going to be packed with flavor and tender too. So if you get underneath this membrane with your fingers, get it started here in a good spot. Keeping your hand on the meat, you can just pull this membrane off like this. Just be careful that you're not ripping the entire portion into shreds when you do it. So we have bison skirt steak. You can leave this as a whole piece. You can cut it into sections. Typically the way we merchandise this is we cut it into these sections like this. And there you have bison skirt steak. All right. So as you can see, that wraps up, that concludes our front quarter of bison. So just to give you an explanation of what we have here, we have our bison ribeyes, we have some stew meat, we have our brisket, we have our ossobuco, our cross-cut shank, we have a brontosaurus rib, we have that mock tender. You can cut these into steak medallions. You can leave it as a roast. You can cut it into stew, stir fry, ground meat, whatever you wish. Bison back ribs. We have our skirt steak, bison flat iron, And then we have our rolled and tied chuck roast. So hopefully you all enjoyed. Just remember, we did this all with just the use of a handsaw. Like I said, typically we'd be using our bandsaw. Things would go a lot faster, the cuts would be cleaner, that sort of thing. But we wanted to show you folks how to do this at home without the use of a bandsaw. So hopefully you enjoyed. We still have our tub here of trimmings and bones to work through. We're gonna get these all cleaned up and we will make these into ground bison. Just for sake of time on the video, we're not gonna go ahead and do all that today. Hopefully you enjoyed. We'll see you for the hind quarter.